All right, guys. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the U.S. Asia Institute's webinar titled On Their Own Terms, Southeast Asia Breaking Away from the U.S.-China Rivalry. My name is Jenna Masmar, and I'm a program assistant here at the U.S. Asia Institute. For those who ever attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you so much for joining us today. We know it's a Friday afternoon. USAI is a nonpartisan United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 46-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and the governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is a part of our Southeast Asia in Focus webinar series. Now a regular program open to the public, our webinars on Southeast Asia serve to shed light on an under-researched region in U.S. policymaking. We hope to offer unique insights into U.S. partnerships with Southeast Asian nations through experts with firsthand knowledge of global power competition and the region overall. I'd like now to introduce our moderator, Chris Fenton. Chris is a trustee of the U.S. Asia Institute. He previously served for 17 years as the president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group and the GM of DMG North America. As a member of the U.S. Asia Institute, Council on Foreign Relations, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and the Third Way think tank, he helps the private sector and Washington navigate America's complicated relationship with China. At present, he speaks regularly as a China expert and serves as the CEO of Media Capital Technologies, having concluded a successful term as senior advisor to IDW Media Holdings. We are grateful to have Chris participating in today's discussion, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Chris to say a few words and introduce our lovely panelists.
Well, thank you, Jenna. I really appreciate the kind introduction, and hello and to everyone, and welcome. I realize it is on a Friday, and myself and at least one of our panelists is fighting a little bit of jet lag, but we're going to try to keep this nice and energetic and fun for everyone. A couple other things that about me is I did write a book on my experience between the U.S. and China in the media and entertainment space called Feeding the Dragon: Inside the Trillion-Dollar Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. Little did I know that that was going to resonate quite a bit with various entities. So I do talk about the U.S.-China relationship quite often. And I have to say, I'm really excited about today's panel because I'm looking forward to learning lots about where the direction is going and what the alternatives happen to be. We definitely appreciate all your time your time participating in this important and timely discussion. As you know from the literature, today's briefing will explore the extent to which the alternative strategic partnerships, such as those with Japan, India, or Australia, can be considered in a Southeast Asia attempt to break away from aligning with the US or with China. Today, we hope to address the question, is there a sufficient alternative partnership that we could realistically compete with on the economic and political strengths of the US or China? I would like to have the pleasure of introducing today's panelists, Elina Noor and Greg Poling. What we're going to do is, once I introduce them, I'm going to hand it over to Elina first. She's going to have some opening remarks. Then it will be turned over to Greg for some opening remarks. And then we're going to jump right into the Q&A session where I'll have some questions that I want to ask. We'll interact, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And then we'll finally have a couple-minute closing, and then everybody will be off on their way within the hour. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two panelists. Elina Noor is a senior fellow in the Asia program at Carnegie, where she focuses on developments in Southeast Asia, particularly the impact and implications of technology in reshaping power dynamics, governance, and nation building in the region. Previously, Elina was the Director of Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Prior to that, Elina was an Associate Professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. She spent most of her career at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia, where she last held the position of Director, Foreign Policy and Security Studies. Elina was formerly with the Brookings Institution's Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World. I've also had the pleasure of working with Elina at a conference at UCLA last, I think it was spring, and I can tell you she is best in the business. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Greg Poling is the Director and Senior Fellow of the Southeast Asia Program and of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center of Strategic and International Studies. He's a leading expert on the South China Sea disputes and conducts research on U.S. alliances and partnerships, democratization, and governance in Southeast Asia and maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. Actually, behind me is the Pacific Ocean, so it's a little relevant today. He is the author of the recently published On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea, along with various works on U.S. relations with Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia at large. His writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, and Naval War College Review, among others. So without spending any more time on me talking, let's get right to our panelists. So Elina, would you start off with some remarks, please?
Thanks so much, Chris, for that very kind introduction. I'm not sure I'm going to be as coherent as you because for everyone on this call, I'm the other panelist who's severely fighting jet lag. So if I don't make any sense, that's going to be my justification/excuse. But what I thought I'd do for you today, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my partner in crime on Southeast Asia Radio, Greg, whom I'm sure will contradict everything I say. What I thought I'd do for you today is to offer 3 points, and the first of which is to set the context in which we find ourselves with this discussion. That is, why are Southeast Asian countries breaking away from this rivalry, or at least trying to? And my first point I would put to you is that it's actually not that easy. And so I think this assumption that Southeast Asian countries are indeed breaking away is premised on a very tenuous effort at the moment to try to find some sort of either middle ground or find a way to assert the agency that Southeast Asian leaders keep talking about in navigating this geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. And I think this is complicated by the fact that there is increasingly a confluence of both public and private sector pressures that did not just start with this Trump administration, but I would argue has actually been in effect for the past 2, maybe 3 administrations, US administrations. And so the writing has been on the wall for Southeast Asian countries, which is why you hear a lot of regional leaders talk about finding this agency and autonomy in order to create a future of their own. But the reality, on the other hand, is that a lot of Southeast Asian supply chains are intimately, deeply integrated into Western supply chains. And this has been over the past few decades. The integration into Chinese supply chains, of course, has been more recent, but extricating themselves from this duality that is now bifurcating between Chinese and the US markets, as well as the whole value chain, particularly in the technological sector, is increasingly becoming difficult. In the past, I think Southeast Asian governments had the luxury of segmenting economics from politics. But as one of the Trump executive orders actually says quite explicitly, because economic security is national security for the US right now, that line between what is economic and what is political is increasingly becoming irrelevant. And so now Southeast Asian leaders find themselves in this position where not only are they deeply part of the economic and financial architecture that was essentially established by the West, but they're also finding it increasingly difficult to partition themselves from the political tensions that are bearing upon them. And I mentioned that this has been kind of across administrations. So you see this distinction, this blurring distinction, particularly starkly in the technological sphere, which undermines everything that the US does right now and China. So technology underpins a lot of the economic developments, a lot of the security and military developments in both the US and China. And it is this blurring in a different way that is making things very difficult for Southeast Asian policy makers. In the final days of the Biden administration, many of you will remember that there was an AI diffusion framework or policy. And the future of that kind of hangs in balance now because the Trump administration is itself conducting a review of where the Trump administration should go in terms of AI policy. But that AI diffusion framework in the final days of the Biden administration essentially grouped countries of the world into three categories. And most Southeast Asian countries, if not all of them, would fall under the second category, where there would be limitations on access to advanced semiconductor chips, but also some of the parameters governing AI development. And you also know that many countries in Southeast Asia are essentially anchoring their economic hopes and aspirations on tech, particularly AI. And so this tightening of the noose on access to not just model weights of these AI systems, but also chips. And increasingly, I think the reality that compute is going to be very, very expensive is going to stymie some of these dreams that countries in Southeast Asia are pinning their hopes on in terms of economic development via AI and other technological developments. Which leads me to my second point, and that is what you're seeing now, of course, in response to this intensification of strategic competition is a strategic diversification in Southeast Asia, particularly amongst countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, all of which decided that they wanted closer ties with BRICS. Indonesia, of course, went full steam ahead, and almost overnight, between the Jokowi and Prabowo administrations, was actually admitted as a full member of BRICS, which surprised many people, including and particularly those in Indonesia itself. And Malaysia, who is chair of the ASEAN grouping this year, has decided that it will also try to pursue this strategy of diversification in its geopolitical outreach to regions and countries that the grouping does not conventionally engage with. So, for example, what you're going to see later in the year is an ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council China summit. But at the same time, because of these concerns in Southeast Asia about unilateral tariffs that the Trump administration has announced on, for example, the export of cars, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors, ASEAN is, under the Malaysian chairmanship, is also probably going to seek a separate meeting with the United States to convey Southeast Asian positions. Unclear if it's all going to be a collective position or if it's going to be individual positions to be conveyed to the United States about this concern over tariffs. And you've heard time and time again over just these past few months, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who is ASEAN chair, stating that the ASEAN region cannot have an overdependence on any one market or industry. So there's increasing awareness that in order to absorb or avoid some of these shocks to the economic structures and systems in Southeast Asia, there needs to be this diversification strategy pursued. But, and this is my third and final point, I would also say that this is not just happening at the government level in Southeast Asia. Increasingly, you're also seeing this amongst the private sector players, as well as academics, researchers, and civil society players on the ground. And I would point you to, I see the Singapore Embassy in DC is on this call, but Singapore in particular has been playing quite a leadership position in advocating for the rise of local large language models in Southeast Asia. And so the country has incubated quite a number of different models that have been released only in the past year or so that cater specifically to the languages in Southeast Asia, so that there's less of a dependence on what AI Singapore calls a wired demographic, Western, industrialized, rich, educated, and developed bias in terms of language models. And you see this being replicated in different countries amongst groups of researchers, including in Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam, as well as in Malaysia. And I would bet that you're probably going to see more of a proliferation of these kinds of local language models as countries seek to break away from this bias, this Western values bias in a lot of the language models that are being used in these countries right now. So I would say that this eagerness to pursue some sort of autonomy and independence is filtering down not only from government to the bottom, but it's also being built up from the bottom up. And I think this is an encouraging position because dependence in the long run is completely unsustainable. And the idea that Southeast Asian countries can rely completely on any one partner, I think, has just gone out the door. So let me just pause here, and I look forward to hearing from Greg, but also to getting questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Elina. I really appreciate that. And I have lots of questions to pose. So let's get to Greg's comments here and we'll get to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Chris and USAI. And unusually for me, I don't disagree with everything Elina just said. I agree with most of it. So, I mean, fundamentally, and most importantly, I agree with the overall framing that Elina gave at the top, which is what Southeast Asian states are seeking is not a separation from the U.S.-China dichotomy, but rather to maximize their own agency within the system, and that's what all nation states seek. So, in a world in which you have three giant markets, China, the U.S., and Europe, and two regional military superpowers, China and the U.S., the idea of separating from either is wholly unrealistic. Right? I mean, unless one wants an autarkic hermit state, there is no alternative but deep engagement with both the U.S. and China. That is not the same, though, as over-reliance on one or the other, as Elina also said. Nobody wants to have to pick a lunch table in the lunchroom. That doesn't mean they don't want to trade and participate in military cooperation, everything else with both. Now, all that said, South Asia is not of one mind. I know we can't have 10 separate webinars on each of these issues, but there's clearly a spectrum here, right? And you could put the Philippines on one end of that spectrum, given its deep relations with the U.S., and then you could move down the line of what the U.S. might like to think of as like-minded on specific issues. So Singapore, Vietnam on certain things, Indonesia on certain things. I'd say Malaysia and Thailand somewhere in the middle right now, trying to maximize cooperation with both sides, although many would argue that perhaps Prime Minister Anwar has leaned more toward Beijing than not. And then you have Laos, Cambodia, clearly more in China's camp on most issues, largely because, at least in the case of Laos, they've been over-leveraged in ways that minimize their agency, and that's what states want to avoid. This is also not synonymous with neutrality, right? When we talk about maximizing agency, when we talk about trying to avoid over-reliance on the U.S. or China, does not mean that states are actually neutral, that they seek a middle way or middle ground on every issue. It simply means that they have the freedom to choose which side they want to be on issues when there are two sides. on an issue-by-issue basis. Sometimes they will agree with preferred U.S. norms or institutions or rules. Sometimes they will not. And that is difficult for the U.S. and also for China to grasp. Where in both Washington and Beijing, there is a presumption that if you're on Team America, you have to be on Team America on all things. If you're on Team China, you have to be on Team China on all things. The U.S. under the Biden administration, I think, got, maybe for the first time in decades, began to get comfortable with the idea that at least for some states, they had to be given space to disagree on pretty fundamental issues. India, Indonesia, Vietnam, all given pretty significant space to say disagree with the U.S. on Russia sanctions, disagree on certain trade matters. The entire national security strategy was rewritten to mitigate the language about autocracies versus democracies in order to make room for Vietnam. And I specifically heard senior administration officials call that the Vietnam rule, that there are bad autocracies and good autocracies, and by good autocracies, we mean Vietnam. Right. So they got comfortable with the idea that if they wanted an Indonesia or a Vietnam or certainly an India to agree with them on certain things, particularly certain things targeting China, they had to let them disagree on others. I'm not sure we're in that world anymore. I think we now are in a world where either you agree on everything or we just don't care and we take our ball and go home. There's not that space for alignment more often than not, which is the way I think the Biden administration would have preferred to see pretty much everybody except the Philippines. Again, I will say the Philippines is unique because the Philippines is a U.S. treaty ally, and the U.S. is going to say if you want a mutual defense treaty, if you want Americans to shed blood, you don't get the same freedom of movement. That's what treaties are. Treaties are intentionally restricting your own freedom of choice. The U.S. has restricted its freedom of choice by agreeing to back the Philippines certain ways, and the Philippines has done the same. Now, on a lot of issues, it is clear that if there ever was a middle ground, it is shrinking, or has entirely disappeared in some places. And I think there is sometimes a certain naivete or a refusal to recognize reality when states talk about refusing to pick sides on some issues. 5G was a good example of this. Every state in the region picked sides on 5G, whether they intended to or not, because they were given a choice. And the choice only had two answers. And refusing to answer was in itself an answer that eliminated that first choice for you, right? There will be more things like that. We see that now on semiconductors. The Commerce Department has decided if you are tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3, and if you want to move from tier 1 to tier 2, there are certain requirements. And all of that is based on a unilateral U.S. decision-making process. Countries don't like it. Perhaps they shouldn't like it, but it is unrealistic to say that there is a middle ground there. There's not. And these are areas where, the U.S. and China both are increasingly going to see the competition in zero-sum terms. The place where I think there's the most room for individual South Asian states, and particularly the more active middle powers like Indonesia and perhaps Vietnam, to carve out space and exercise their own agency, is on rulemaking and norms and institutions, areas where there are not yet fully set boundaries on what the U.S. model is, what the Chinese model is, or better yet, where the U.S. in particular doesn't have a model, like digital economy rules, AI. This is where I think we can see more activism, not just from an Indonesia, Vietnam, also in India, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, efforts to make sure that the world doesn't get carved up into a U.S. model and a Chinese model, or increasingly a European model and a Chinese model, because the U.S. doesn't really set rules anymore. The Europeans do. And this is one of the reasons that I think why I'm surprised by its speed. I was not surprised by Prabowo's decision to join BRICS immediately, because by entering BRICS, he made a big announcement that Indonesia is a middle power, and Indonesia sits at the table when rules are written. Last thing I'd say is I do think that while this offers both challenges and opportunities to Southeast Asia, and by which I mean particularly the larger countries of South Asia, I think it presents a particular challenge to ASEAN as an institution. Because if the greatest opportunity is to help establish new institutions and forge new rules and norms, ASEAN is struggling to keep up with that process. The rules and norms that are being pursued by an Indonesia, by a Singapore, a Vietnam, even a Philippines or Malaysia are most often not being done in the context of ASEAN. Yes, perhaps ASEAN will come up with a digital framework agreement this year. And that digital economy framework will be a watered down version of things that individual members have already agreed with non-ASEAN counterparts. So ASEAN increasingly risks not only the existing challenge it faced, which was being pulled apart by US-China frictions on things like the South China Sea or the Mekong, but now it also faces the risk that its own member states view it as an ineffective vehicle to exercise their agency, because ASEAN is stuck with a lowest common denominator decision-making process that basically means that it deals with 20th century economic problems in a 21st century world. And if you want to talk about real nuts and bolts stuff on AI, 5G, digital economy, space, and cyber, you do it in other venues, not in ASEAN. And I think that's all I got. So I welcome any questions.
Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate that. I'm trying to figure out what question I want to ask first, but I'll pose this to both of you. Which, between the US and China, who's put more of an effort into winning over alliances in the region? And for the one who is lagging behind, what would you recommend that nation to do in order to win over more favoritism from the region? Elina, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So I think it's easy to generalize by saying that the US has seemed to, particularly under the current administration, has seemed to exert more pressure than anything else over choices that are to be made in Southeast Asia. But that's not to say that China has not done the same, particularly when there have been frictions with different countries in Southeast Asia. So, for example, the whole, bananas with the Philippines is an off-cited example that's been given. But I think there are differences and textures that we need to be aware of when thinking about some of the carrots and sticks that have been put on the table by not just the governments of the US and China, but also, private sector stakeholders, for example. And so I think there's been more willingness to find common ground, despite some of the governmental pressures that have been asserted, both by Beijing as well as Washington. And I think this idea of considering different stakeholders and their interests is one that is important to keep in mind. Because sometimes, even the business community, as you well know, Chris, does not always share very same or similar sentiments to its government.
Greg?
Yeah, I don't have a satisfying answer to give because the US is very good at self-flagellation. It's kind of what we do in the think tank world. So I write a lot more about what the US gets wrong than I do about what it gets right. And you don't have that in China. You don't have the same amount of, I think, honest criticism. So we often get an impression that the US is entirely absent on certain things and China's eating America's lunch. But the picture is more nuanced than that. If you look at things like the Lowy Power Index, if you look at the State of South Asia surveys each year, you just look at the numbers put out by OECD on the trade investment front. In relative terms, certainly China is more engaged with ASEAN than it was. I mean, compared to the US, say, 15 years ago, or I guess with individual South Asian countries, because the US is actually more engaged as an institution than it was 15 years ago. But that, on absolute terms, it depends on what we're talking about. The US is still the preferred security partner of almost every country in the region. The only place that China has really sophisticated military engagement at all is in Thailand, and that's just limited to air-to-air stuff. So, I mean, even among the countries that have expressed the most concern about the US, they still prefer engagements with the US military, FMF and FMS from the US. They're not looking to purchase, for the most part, Chinese equipment. On the econ side, yeah, China's the biggest partner in trading goods with each country. The U.S. is the biggest partner in trade and services. The U.S. is the larger FDI provider to the region overall, far more in Singapore, a bit more in Thailand. And in most of the other countries, it's kind of hard to separate these, right? Because, take Vietnam. China's the largest source of imports to Vietnam, and the U.S. is the largest source of exports. If you remove either one of those poles, the other one falls down. This is not an independent relationship. Vietnam buys from China in order to sell to the U.S. And, Cambodia is quite similar. ODA is going to be a problem. The U.S. was the biggest ODA provider until a month ago. Now China's going to step in and fill that void. Diplomacy is hit or miss. Yeah, China's got more missions and has more visits. But the U.S. has more institutional programs, more cooperative partnerships. So I certainly think the U.S. should be doing a lot more. I think it would be impossible to prove the argument that China is, quote, doing more in Southeast Asia across the board.
So the nuance is pretty unbelievable, and I'm getting that from both of you. So I think I guess a more black and white question in terms of the region would be in the event that Beijing decides to reunify with Taiwan, which seems to be something that much of our Pentagon believes could be a possibility in the next, say, 5 or 7 years. Who in the region would go out of their way to, assuming the United States decides to defend Taiwan's sovereign rights, who would go out of their way in the region to align themselves immediately with us? Who in the region would immediately try to side and support the China side of the equation?
I think most countries would go out of their way to avoid having to choose such a stark binary. And you've already heard a lot of rhetoric to this effect. And I think it depends on the equities of each country in such a confrontation, right? The Philippines, obviously, with the large overseas foreign worker population in Taiwan, would be most interested in ensuring the safety of their population abroad. That said, I'm not sure that they would go full in with the United States in trying to antagonize China and put their own security at risk any more than they're willing to bear. And I think most countries in the region would rather not participate and would rather not have that eventuality come to fruition. And so right now, unfortunately, there are governments that are praying and hoping that there will be a more conciliatory approach between Beijing and Washington on the issue of Taiwan, which may well turn out to be the case with this administration.
The Philippines is the only maybe in that question, right? The Philippines may or may not, say, grant U.S. military access to EDCA sites. The Philippines may or may not provide support on intelligence collection and targeting and things like that. The choice for the Philippines will be simple and stark, more so than anybody else in the region, which will be either you can have an alliance with the Americans or you can be neutral. There's no world in which Americans can die 200 miles off the coast of the Philippines and the Philippines do nothing. So the Philippines will get to make a choice. Everybody else in the region will, as Elina said, try to avoid that choice as much as possible. Now, I do think there will be a big spectrum on kind of quietly how countries feel about who started it. It'll be contingent, very contingent on whether or not there's a Taiwanese Declaration of Independence or something like that, or if China just, decides to launch missiles because Xi Jinping's feeling his age. I also think there will be a lot of just sitting back and waiting to see both, one, do the Americans intervene, and two, are they likely to win? The response to a world in which the U.S. has successfully stopped an amphibious assault on Taiwan is very different than the response if the U.S. has tried and failed to do so. Meaning you'll get a lot more diplomatic and maybe economic support for a program to dissuade further Chinese aggression if the U.S. has already succeeded once. If it looks like the U.S. is going to lose, everybody's going to keep quiet. But I don't see anybody in the region who's actually going to endorse the Chinese invasion, even Cambodia, which has been, ironically, one of the strongest in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Well, thank you. Yes, once again, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I really respect the perspective of both of you. Because the Singapore embassy is on here, I do have a question in terms of how they've balanced the U.S. and China partnerships, and as well as diversified a digital economy with the EU nations and the Middle East. And I'm curious if either of you think the Singapore model is realistic for other ASEAN states.
I'll take a crack at it. I don't think, with respect to the Singaporean representatives on the line, I don't think the Singapore model is replicable to any Southeast Asian nation. Singapore is unique in the sense that it is so deeply integrated and a part of the global trading and financial and now increasingly technological spaces that includes all those plays you mentioned, Chris. And it's really a matter of survival for them to not antagonize any one particular party and to keep stability both internally and in their external relations with partners as predictable as possible. And all the other countries have different interests, different priorities, different capacities and capabilities. So the short answer is I think the Singapore model is unique.
Greg, do you agree?
Yeah, my mother told me that we're all unique, but yes, Singapore as a small and extraordinarily wealthy majority Chinese city-state that has welcomed U.S. aircraft carriers for 35 years is clearly unique in a lot of ways that other states don't. And it gives Singapore, I think, a certain freedom of movement with both of the parties. Singapore, in many ways, is invaluable to both Beijing and Washington, and therefore it certainly doesn't escape pressure, but I think gets more leeway sometimes than other states in the region do from both sides.
Well, thank you. Let's, I guess, switch it maybe to the north in Japan. Multiple opinion polls. Tokyo has gained very high trust from leaders in Southeast Asia, sometimes surpassing the trust of the US, China, India, and even the European Union. I'm curious, given the recent domestic turmoil in Northeast Asia, can Japan be a stabilizing actor in Southeast Asia at this time?
I mean, as you correctly pointed out, Chris, Japan has been seen as a trusted player for a long time, despite the history in many countries in Southeast Asia. And I think that's a remarkable phenomenon on its own. But I think there are certain governments in Southeast Asia that sometimes feel unease with the political alignment that Tokyo has taken in terms of Washington's policies. And the closer Japan is to the United States, particularly on some of its more controversial defense and security policies and measures, I think the more that discomfort is going to grow among some Southeast Asian countries. That said, I think Tokyo has shown quite a bit of creative diplomacy and independence from Washington, for example, in its own proactive engagement with Laos, with Cambodia, and that's been, very distinct from how Washington has approached those two countries. And so I think it's issues based, but I saw the recent headlines about how there's a bit of a pushback now on foreign aid financing by Japan because of the cuts that the Trump administration has taken to USAID and some of the other financial assistance programs in the United States. So we'll see if that has a long-term impact on Japan's influence in Southeast Asia. But I think these kinds of alignments with Washington by Tokyo can be quite disturbing and disruptive to Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Greg.
I I think Elina's point on the decreasing support for overseas development assistance in Japan is a noteworthy one. I saw the same article. Japan is continuing to face a struggling economy. It has effectively a minority government. It has carried more than its fair share of the weight for development assistance, investment, and trade in the region for decades. basically filling all the slots that the U.S. is unwilling or unable to fill, but it doesn't have much more to give, right? There is a limit on how much soft power and influence Japan can evince from its long history as an investment partner and a provider of overseas development assistance. And that the reason that Japan is so trusted and has had so much influence is because that is a fairly values neutral way of engagement that Japan has been engaged in since the 1970s. As Lena said, the more Japan becomes a regional security provider, the more it becomes aligned with the US and other allies in pushing back on China and pushing back on Russia, the less it can claim to be a neutral player on a lot of these issues. And to be fair, I mean, Japan was never an entirely neutral player. Everybody understood there was an alliance, but it was one thing when it was an alliance in which Japan's presence was almost entirely through pop culture and investment. That's no longer the case. There is again a clear kind of spectrum of comfort with this though. And on the one end, you have the Philippines, which last June concluded a reciprocal access agreement to welcome Japanese live fire exercise on Philippine territory, the first time since the end of World War II that Japanese troops have been regularly welcomed to any Asian nation. We are seeing the evolution of a more networked alliance structure in the region involving the US, Japan, Korea, Philippines, to a degree, Canada, New Zealand, some involvement from the French and Germans, and some engagement of that kind of Indo-Pacific and European alliance networks through the IP4, which could evolve into the IP5, involving the Philippines going to NATO meetings next few years. So the Philippines is going to be deepening every aspect of its relationship with Japan for years to come. And that becomes even more important amid the uncertainty of the Trump administration. But nobody else has quite made that choice or will.
Fascinating. I guess what I'd like to do is see if anybody in the audience has some questions. I got plenty more to fill the time here, but I want to make sure we're hitting everybody's key points. Do people want to text in some questions? And perhaps I'll ask one more, and then I'll hit what comes through my text in my chat panel. Jenna, you don't have any questions right now, do you? From the audience?
None from the audience at my
Okay,
point, but I think we can ask one last question while we give everyone a chance to type
perfect.
in the chat box.
Great. Well, I guess one question keeping it on the Japanese subject is as far as China's mindset, do they feel like the Japanese influence in the region is a majority Japanese related, or are they feeling that there's a real US backing to the way Japan is trying to influence the region?
That's a tough one. I don't know what Beijing thinks of Tokyo, but I think, when Tokyo makes suggestions like, or Tokyo in relation with its other Western allies makes suggestions about having a NATO office in the region, I think it's safe to assume that Beijing probably thinks that that is at the behest of the West, if not completely triggered by Japanese defense concerns themselves. So I guess I'm saying that if I paid closer attention to some of the political developments coming out of Beijing, I would be able to have a more nuanced answer. But I think it really depends on what the issue is at hand.
I think we can clearly tell where China's rhetoric is. China's rhetoric is that all things China doesn't like is the result of a US containment strategy. And so when Japan does anything that China doesn't like, it's because the Americans made Japan do it. And when Japan does anything that China does like, it's because Japan saw the light and is a rational actor. And the same is true of the Philippines, same is true of Australia, same was true of Korea, most especially with the THAAD deployment. There's a kind of an overarching problem with China's refusal to recognize the agency of any small state. You only have agency when you do things China likes. If you disagree with China, it's not because China did anything wrong. and you through your own agency objected, it must be because the Americans forced you to. And that has been, I think, at one of the core problems for Beijing for the last 15 years. And one of the reasons that the US, despite all of our foibles and, overbearing presence, are still welcomed in the region, because China keeps, you know, getting in its own way. Yeah.
So, well, because maritime issues very well, I'm really curious where you think, well, whether you could update us on where the Philippine dispute is with China right now, currently, and where you think it goes from here. And obviously, Elina, please chime in also.
Um, so the Philippines, I think, has done a pretty good job of uh, stabilizing its strategic position as best it could after 6 years of free fall under the previous government of Rodrigo Duterte. The Philippines spent last year staring down dozens of Chinese vessels in its attempt to resupply and ultimately repair the Sierra Madre, this old World War II era ship it's got at a Second Thomas Shoal. It's reestablished patrol routes in places like Scarborough Shoal that had been abandoned under the previous government. And it's done all that while avoiding so far escalation with Beijing, even though they've come uncomfortably close a few times. And paired with that, the Philippines has been able to engineer a once in a generation modernization of the alliance with the Americans. And as I indicated, build out this new role within a regional security architecture that the Philippines never played before. It now has deep and robust military ties with Japan, Australia. Korea is the largest provider of military equipment to the Philippines now. They're negotiating access agreements that will be finished by the summer with Canada, New Zealand, France, and Germany, probably later in the year. The Philippines is in the strongest position it's been for years, but the situation remains extraordinarily dangerous, and that's because every single day we have some uncomfortably large number of Chinese vessels operating in places that legally belong to the Philippines. And most of those interactions are unprofessional, but they don't escalate. But every single one has some small chance, right? If you keep ramming boats and using water cannons, eventually you're going to kill a guy on accident. Then that's when things could really escalate. So I think we should, I applaud the Philippines, but that does not mean the South China Sea is getting any safer. Quite the opposite. We could wake up tomorrow and find out that we all spent too much time thinking about Taiwan, and now there's a U.S.-China conflict in the South China Sea.
And is that on just a quick follow-up question? Is that area of dispute purely a military strategic point for China, or is there real resource opportunities there as far as fisheries and, say, minerals, energy, et cetera?
I mean, it's both and neither. Yeah, if you're a fisherman who gets subsidized by the state to go down there, it's a pretty good way to make a living, better than actually fishing. If you're a Chinese national oil company, of course you want to advance your deep sea drilling operations under the guise of Xi Jinping's rights protection mission. And if you're the PLA Navy, you want to get as much funding as you can from the state by insisting that this is key to your effort to contest access to the first island chain with the Americans. But none of that explains why Xi Jinping does all of this. I mean, at its core, this is an issue of political myth making. It's a nationalist fairy tale, like most territorial disputes, that has been retold and retold and retold until claim became historical fact in the minds of most Chinese leaders and Chinese citizens. Xi Jinping then elevated that by making it a key part of his China dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, going all the way back to his first speech on the subject in 2013. And he's not going to compromise on it. It's too important to his legitimacy and the legitimacy of the party. And for the same reason that, human beings have fought over strategically and economically insignificant spits of land since as long as we've been forming ourselves into social bodies, we shouldn't expect some hyper degree of rationality from China here. They want it because they told themselves it's theirs.
Elina, do you have anything to add on this particular subject? Because I do have something for you.
Well, I think I just say that while there have been no indications that the nature of the alliance relationship will change between Manila and Washington under the Trump administration, I think policymakers in Manila have got to be watching what's going on with Ukraine right now and wondering to themselves what the quid pro quo will be in the coming years if it comes to that.
Chris, I know we're at time, but just one quick point, because Alina's absolutely right. I think everybody's going to be worried. But the one thing that the Philippines feels very good about is that this week, Marco Rubio issued a waiver on $350 million in foreign military financing that's been waiting to be distributed to the Philippines. The only other two countries that have gotten those waivers are Taiwan and Ukraine. And the Philippine Foreign Secretary and Defense Secretary got the first phone calls from each of their counterparts here. And Marcos is almost certainly going to be the first head of state in South Asia who gets a visit with Trump. So I think the Philippines' perspective is they're uncomfortable, but they feel like they're getting far better treatment than any U.S. European ally and any other partner in Asia.
I think Jenna probably got time for, I'm getting a couple questions in here. The first one is for either of you, as to any thoughts on this week's ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting where intra-regional defense industry cooperation and standardization of procurement regulations across member states as a response to rising geopolitical uncertainties? That is the question. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I thought the most interesting thing to come out of the ADMM meeting was Philippine Secretary Teodoro again making a speech that demands ASEAN cohesion on the South China Sea, which was code for, and specifically, he didn't say China, but specifically said, it's more important that we all hang together than to be bullied by an outside party. On the question of defense industry, there's three different defense industries in Southeast Asia. There's the US/NATO base that makes the core of the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. There's the Russian/Soviet built militaries of Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. And then there's the hodgepodge in Malaysia and Indonesia, where they basically run two separate militaries. And not a lot of room for cooperation there. Other than Indonesia does make vessels that they can sell to everybody.
I will just add that the ADMM retreat just wrapped up, but so did the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting. And I expect a statement to come out later today, if not tomorrow, if it hasn't already come out. And there, I think there are actually more interesting developments that are fleshing out in that space. Greg mentioned the DEFA, the Digital Economic Framework Agreement. I'm a little more optimistic about it than Greg is. And I think going back to our earlier discussion about agency, some of the really interesting developments that have come out have been things just like on the ground practical solutions for most of the businesses in Southeast Asia, over 90% of which constitute micro, small, and medium enterprises. So things like the use of local currencies for cross-border transactions, for example, just harmonizing some of these financial transactions, but also the rules governing them. And that, I think, is going to make a much bigger impact to the communities in Southeast Asia in the long run.
I'm going to ask one last quick question for both of you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jenna. Over the next 5 years, would you put more of a percent chance in the region finding a calming equilibrium, or one that goes more and more into a chaotic state? Elina.
I'm more optimistic, and every time I go to the region, I just returned from the region, I'm really encouraged by the promise of ASEAN that is still not so great amongst the younger generation, but I think more and more of the youth are starting to put their faith in ASEAN because of this lack of an alternative, seeing as to how the existing world order seems to be crumbling before our eyes. So I am cautiously optimistic, and maybe Greg differs from me on that.
Greg, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm a natural optimist.
Okay, good.
Except when it comes to things like the code of conduct in the South China Sea. Then I'm not. But I I honestly I don't know because this is all so contingent on events that will happen beyond ASEAN's borders as well as within each of the member states. What I can say is I think there are futures that are now closed off, right? We're way past a unipolar moment. We know there's no hegemony from either the US or China coming to the region. We are now past peak China, and I say that not as a political statement, but in relative terms. We have now entered a period where for decades to come, ASEAN on net will grow faster than China. And China will shrink as a proportion of the relative global economy and will shrink as a proportion of the relative global population. So we are now entering a more contested space in which, the things like the rise of the rest that Fareed Zakaria wrote about 25 years ago and Barack Obama heralded could actually be happening. How ASEAN navigates that, I don't know. But there is no longer a chance of either a condominium of power between the US or China or Chinese hegemony over the region, which is what we were worried about 15 years ago.
Well, this was fascinating. Elina, Greg, I really appreciate it. I just want to hand it back over to Jenna for some closing remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys all so much for such a fruitful discussion on a really significant region. I'd like to extend our thanks to our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise, and a thanks to our audience for their participation in today's very important discussion. While we are running out of time for this portion of today's event, if you would like to follow up with any of today's speakers, please reach out to us and we would be happy to assist you all in fostering further dialogue on the things that we discussed today. So thank you again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.